Welcome to the Paintman Journeying channel. I am the Paintman Journeying. We're into the final part of this series now, where I paint the Orc Necromancer from Artisans Guild. If you missed the other two parts, be sure to check them out. In this part, we're going to get a lot more colorful, as I'll be getting to the magic emanating from all over the orc. But first, finishing up some of the other small details. Starting with the same colors I had on my palette as last time, carbon black, orange, warm yellow and cool yellow, and white. I wanted to make a gray cloak, and I knew that going in, but I wanted to make it a dusky gray. And what I mean by that is usually you would mix in some brown. Well, having learned that brown is made by mixing carbon black and the orange, all I had to do was add a bit of orange to the mix, and it gave me the exact effect I wanted. So to base coat it, I did an outline, but the brush I have is a 2, I think, and it's very fine too, so it's good for base coating over a lot of the model, but I just went with the edges because I do have a larger brush to get the larger center. Here's my larger brush, and you'll see it's a flat head. Now I've actually come to really like these flat brushes for miniature painting because I find them so much easier to loaded brush with. I know it sounds weird, but essentially if you have kind of the chisel tip, you can load the brush up and then only put the other pigment in one corner of the brush, which means you have a lot more paint on the brush in order to spread it out over the model. Now I'm not doing that here, I'm just base coating, and I'll show that maybe in a later video because I don't do it on this model. It's just I wanted to show that I use chisel brushes instead of larger and larger brushes. Now here I was experimenting, and so I have the GW washes, and I was just going to give this an overall wash to see if I can add a bit more brown. So this is, I think, the I can't pronounce it. The Argax Earthshade, and I just did an overall wash of it. Now it did annoy me a little bit because it came out shinier, but I think that's because I mixed it with the scale 75 thinner and not water, and so it doesn't matter in the end because I do go over it with another wash of just paint, but it did come out a bit shiny when I did that. Now the reason I love painting fur is because you get to use a very fine brush and a lot of texture. So here I just take my next color up and I'm just painting in strands of hair. So really all I'm doing is I'm loading the brush up with paint, making sure it's wet by having my humidifier in there, and then along each of these thicker strands, I guess you would call them, I'm painting smaller strands of fur and hair. And so I do this with one color kind of all over it, just to give it that overall texture. Then when I start mixing in more paint to lighten it up, I'll get more selective with where these strands of hair go. And so I want the top of the cloak to be a bit more bright than the deeper recesses. And so even though I've lightened the paint, it's not going to go on every spot. It's only going to go on the more uppermost hairs by his shoulder there. You can see how fine those strands are being painted on, and once I have the original strands, then it becomes easy to know which ones to highlight. You're just kind of following the work that you already did. Now this is where I can also use that flathead brush as a good kind of wet blend brush. And so the brush itself is wet, but you can see I'm only dipping the corner into it and then putting that corner in the recess. And so as I kind of paint along, it gets thinned out along the model itself. It's a wash, but it's a controlled wash. And I do that, you can do that with a normal brush too, like I do here, where I kind of wash the whole area, put just the tip on the black, make sure the paintbrush is a little more damp, and then spread it out. But as you spread it out, it will become more watered down. And then I do that with both a brown to begin with and then a black. And then any of the detail I lost by doing that, because it does become thick in some areas, I just bring back with a bit more fine lining. And then here I also add small little strands of hair erratically, kind of like you would see on a dog, how they have like one brown fur amongst a bunch of blonde fur. It just kind of gives the illusion that there's random strands. So I wanted to talk about what I like and don't like about the Kimera Kolor pots. So the big difference between them and dropper bottles is that they're flip top. The good thing about flip top is you're never gonna lose the lid for each bottle, which, I mean, I have a tendency to drop stuff off my desk, so that's a good thing. But the bad thing about it is they do kind of get in the way when I'm putting paint onto the palette itself. I like to get my bottles right on the palette and squeeze and lift to get the paint out, but in this case, the lid prevents me from getting it all the way down. The other thing I don't like about the flip caps is that paint will dry on the inside. Again, I live in a very dry climate, and so paint dries quickly. Now, I don't think it'll dry inside the bottle, but it does dry inside the cap, and you'll get these little kind of dry paint bits coming off, which is nice. It's easy to clean, but then they also get into your palette and on your desk, and it's something that you have to manage every time you open one of these bottles. That being said, I do still have a problem with dropper bottles, as you can see here. I had to use a pin in order to get this one to float correct. Although I prefer dropper bottles, it's not like they don't come without issue for me as well. That said, here's what I'm adding: black metal, heavy metal, and white alchemy, all from scale 75. Now I'll be doing the metallics. So in the original mix, this is a trick I learned from an online tutorial I watched somewhere, is that when you're doing your metallics, start with a paint and then just mix in a few of the metallic flakes, and that'll be your base color. Now in this, I'm essentially using the teal that I did the base coat for the magic here, and adding that to black, and then adding that dark metal. And then I'm base coating all the metallic parts, so the book and the sword. The reason I added the teal is because it's the source of the magic here, and I wanted to make the metal kind of match seamlessly. As I'm base coating the sword, I leave certain parts black, because again, those are the ones I want to be the darkest points on that sword. And so if I just leave them black, then I just have to blend and not worry about adding more black. And then from that, I just mix in more of the base color. And so I mix in a little bit of turquoise as well, but all I'm doing is adding more of the metallic flakes to the paint now. And this you layer up like you would any normal paint, and the shift between them acts as your blend. And so even though it's the same color, because some areas have less of the metallic flakes and some more, you see this shift in color. And that's what makes this kind of a really good method, is that you only have to use one or two colors of metallics. So here I just use a little bit brighter silver for the very edges and highlights, and then I'll have one more that I'll do on the very tips like you would with a white. I'm still rusty on my sword blending. I know a lot of people like to do the very stark contrast, so they'll do from black to white on certain parts of the blade and make it really contrasted but really cool looking in that non-metallic metal way. I've just never been good at finding the hard contrast and laying out the weapon for those short blends, and so it's something I will have to practice. I do, however, like to add small scratches to the sword, usually in the direction of a single direction, in order to make it look like brushed steel when you're using actual steel. And then I also do want to try to pump up those contrasts, even though I'm not that great at it, and so I use the airbrush here just to blend out some of the metallics with black. So the part I was most excited to paint was this one, the magic effects emanating from around him. I'm using the artist color turquoise blue, which is a mix of phthalo blue and phthalo green, because again my green shade for the Kimera Kolors was a bit borked. So I just taking the easy way out and using the turquoise that I already have. Now I really add a lot of thinner to this, and the reason I'm doing that is basically the shape of the magic itself. And so I use a lot of thinner, and then I wick out my brush on a piece of paper towel. This is why I do it this way, is because these areas are very flat, so there's not really an edge to highlight, more than there is just areas I want to be brighter on this stream of magic. And so there are points that I'd like to be brighter, but they're not like sharp points. So that's why I find this kind of painting fun, because you can keep your large brush, you don't even need it at a very good point, you just need to be able to cover a large area, and because of the translucent paint, have it fade out kind of when you get to the point where you no longer want it to be as bright as you're going to go. So you want to get all the edges, and you want to get them a few times with each successively lighter color, but it's not even that big of a deal if you miss it once or twice, because that just kind of adds to the magic-y look to it. So I do add a bit of yellow here just to get a bit of a tone shift, but to also lighten it up. So I add a bit of yellow and a bit of white, because I don't want it to go all the way to white. I do want to keep a lot of that color. And so as I'm painting, because it's again the translucent, but it's still wet paint, I'm pulling the paint to sit in the area that I want to finish with that highlight. So you'll see I'm kind of pulling the paint up and then back towards the middle and lifting my brush in the middle, because that's where I want the lightest part to be. And so as I add more and more white, you'll see that I continue to pull towards that center point, but because the paint is so thinned out, it'll remain translucent over the other layers. And again, I'm not even going that sharp. I'm keeping the brush strokes wide. I'm just making sure that they only cover essentially the flat areas that I want to be brighter. So this kind of where the magic turns was a good candidate to just have a little bit brighter. But you don't want just a straight up edge highlight, because then it would look almost, to me, it wouldn't look flowing. And because the magic is the light source itself, you still want to sometimes paint deeper recesses brighter, just because it looks like it would be a point that would be illuminated by itself. moving on to the last few touches that the model is going to get, I'm using airbrush for this to provide the illumination on the model itself that the magic is creating. And so just adding a bit of the teal to very thin down, I'm spraying it on parts that I think the light from the magic would hit. And so obviously the top of the sword here where it's emanating, I actually want to spray slowly in layers, building it up as you go, but lightening these sources of the magic. Now the hardest part to do this on is the eyes, so that's why I really like this airbrush, is it's got a very fine tip, and if you mask the model and hold the airbrush as still as possible, you can actually spray circles around the eyes with this very thin down paint a few times and build it up over and over, and it'll create a glow around that eye. And because the sword itself was the source, I kind of extended it more than just what the magic touches. Then just do any touch-ups I need to, or any very points that you think need to be brighter, I just do with a very fine brush. Now to add a tone shift, so I add some cold yellow to my palette, and I mix it into my airbrush. Now I'm actually going very thick with the pigment here because I am trying to go over blue with a yellow. I didn't need as many layers as I thought because I went very heavy with it. I'm just painting the area around the skulls, not worrying too much if I overspray on any of them, but just get that first layer down and let it dry. And then while that was drying, I took the opportunity to dot the eyes of the book here because I had sprayed it as well, kind of like the glow around the eyes on his face, and just wanted to give it a glow. And then back to the yellow. Once it was dry, that other layer was dry, threw down more of this yellow straight over those skulls. It was so amazingly quick how well it worked, just to get this color shift. And so it brightened it up quite a bit because again I did have the heavy amount of pigment in there, and once I had the color that I wanted, I just went and did a few highlights with some white on the very edges of the skulls itself, because again they're their own kind of yellow light source that's mixing with the teal, and so I have to make sure that they were emanating their own light. So unlike a light source hitting the model, in this case I just did, because normally if the light source was coming in from over his shoulder, you would only want to highlight the one side, but because these are their own light source, I'm getting all the edges left and right on that skull. And then to finish him off, you just gotta cross your T's and dot your I's. And he's done. So that's it for this guy. Off camera, I dry brushed his base quickly and added some weathering pigments to bring the whole model together. 20 years of this and I still really hate basing. It's one of my weaknesses when it comes to this hobby, though at least nowadays some of the hard work is done for me, I just have to paint it. The last thing I want to do in my videos is summarize all the things I've learned over the course of a project. This is a journey like any other, and I'm still learning things and trying things, so everything I'm going to show you on this channel has to have a lesson. These are the ones I learned this time. First thing I figured out most about was the Kimera Kolors themselves and single pigment paints, just how vibrant they are, and the concentration of the pigment, just how little I needed in order to cover a surface area or to get a good finish out of my airbrush. Speaking of finish, when I researched them, it said that they were a very matte paint, and while they are matte, they're not as matte as the Ultra Mattes from Scale 75, I find, so they're a good in between. Then I also learned about color mixing, how to mix common colors that normally you don't get from single pigments like brown and khaki. I also discovered how chalkiness happens, so when it happened to me, I had to look it up and found out that it was because the paint went through a freeze and thaw cycle far too many times when it was getting shipped to me. It ruined the acrylic polymer, and so there was a small way to fix it by adding medium to a small batch, but you can't really save the whole bottle. I also learned more about how to paint for video and what I kind of messed up in this one. Next time I think I'll stay within a certain section of a model and only paint that for camera and do the rest maybe off, so that way I stay in focus on a specific part and show exactly how I paint that part, but not do the whole thing if there's too much like armor or fur. And then the other thing I need to focus on is staying in frame. During editing and even some of the shots that I left in, my model would leave the frame and you wouldn't get to see what I could do. And I feel like I could do a lot better at checking my monitor to make sure that everything is squared up. And lastly, some critiques on myself about what I could do better for the video itself. One of the things that would make it easier on me is to edit after each painted section. So it takes about 3 days to paint the model. There's no reason I couldn't edit after each painting session. I also need to focus more on my focus. A lot of the shots in this one were out of focus because I didn't bother to change it when I went from palette to model because it was a static shot. So I could either get another camera for my palette or just actually focus on changing the focus when I need to. Also, I find it might be a little hard to see what I'm doing sometimes. So maybe I can add an additional light to the desk just to add a little bit more fill. And finally, get a little bit closer. It is a bit harder to paint underneath the camera, but for some things, like I did with the eyes in this one, I could get much closer. One more time, a big thank you for everyone who watched this series. It's my first step into YouTube, and it's very daunting. I do have a background in video production, but it's a whole different beast when you're putting yourself out there. So I'll leave you with this terrible pun. Thanks for watching, and although I may not be a journeyman painter, I am a